The room was silent except for the soft whispers of mourners gathered around the polished wooden coffin. Tears streamed down their faces as they paid their final respects to Sarah, a beloved figure who had touched so many lives. But in the corner, Max, her loyal golden retriever, began growling, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down everyone's spine. As the pastor prepared to deliver the final words, Max barked furiously, his paws scratching at the coffin. The crowd gasped, unsure whether to be alarmed or dismiss the dog's odd behavior. When the lid was slowly opened to calm him down, what they saw inside made everyone scream in horror. The dimly lit funeral home was filled with a somber stillness, broken only by the occasional soft sniffles of grieving loved ones. Rows of neatly arranged chairs faced the front of the room, where a polished wooden coffin rested atop a velvet-draped platform. The air carried the faint aroma of lilies, their fragrance bittersweet, mingling with the quiet murmur of whispered condolences. The walls were adorned with framed photographs of the deceased, capturing moments of joy and laughter, now a stark contrast to the sorrowful atmosphere. Family members and friends had gathered, their faces etched with the raw pain of loss. Some clutched tissues in trembling hands, while others offered comforting embraces to those who could not contain their tears. The heavy weight of grief hung in the air, palpable and unrelenting, as if the room itself mourned the departure of a beloved soul. A soft hymn played in the background, its melancholy melody weaving through the room like a quiet prayer. Amid the mourning, there was one figure that stood out, a golden retriever named Max. He sat near the coffin, his ears perked and his gaze fixed intently on the polished wood. Unlike the mourners, whose sorrow manifested in tears and sobs, Max's behavior was different, almost unsettling. He neither whined nor wagged his tail. Instead, he let out low, occasional growls, his eyes sharp and alert, as if he were guarding something precious or sensing something amiss. His presence added a layer of unease to the already heavy atmosphere. Max had always been a loyal companion to Sarah, the deceased. Those who knew the pair could attest to their inseparable bond. Max had been by Sarah's side through thick and thin, offering her unconditional love and unwavering loyalty. It was only natural for him to be present on this day, yet his behavior was far from natural. The mourners exchanged puzzled glances, their whispers carrying a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Why is he growling like that?" one woman murmured to the person seated beside her. "Maybe he is just confused or scared," the other replied, though their voice held a note of uncertainty. Max's growls grew louder, his posture tense. He began to scratch at the floor near the coffin, his claws making faint scraping sounds against the polished wood. Some of the mourners grew visibly uneasy, their gazes shifting from the coffin to the dog. The pastor, standing near the front, paused mid-sentence and looked toward Max with a concerned frown. The unease in the room began to spread like a ripple. The mourners' whispers turned into hushed discussions, and the solemnity of the moment seemed to fracture under the weight of the dog's strange behavior. Was Max merely reacting to the overwhelming grief around him? Or was there something more? The question lingered unspoken, but it was evident in the way people's eyes darted nervously to the coffin and then back to the dog. The atmosphere grew heavier, the once soft and sorrowful air now tinged with a sense of foreboding. It was as if the funeral home itself had begun to feel oppressive, its shadows stretching longer and its corners growing darker. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustle of fabric seemed amplified, making hearts beat a little faster. The mourner's sadness was slowly being replaced by an unshakable tension. Max's barking, though infrequent, carried an urgency that was impossible to ignore. It was not the sound of a dog seeking attention. It was the sound of a warning. Some people tried to calm Max, offering him soft words and gentle pats on the head. Yet he remained steadfast, his eyes locked on the coffin, as if it held a secret only he could sense. The room began to feel colder, though no one dared to voice it. Shivers ran down spines, but whether it was from the chill in the air or the unease creeping into their hearts, no one could tell. An elderly man sitting near the front shook his head slowly. "Dogs can sense things we cannot," he muttered under his breath, drawing a few curious looks. His words hung in the air, unchallenged but unsettling. Max let out another bark, this one louder and more forceful, causing some mourners to flinch. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the fragile silence like a crack of thunder. As the tension mounted, the focus of the mourners began to shift. Their grief, once directed solely towards Sarah's passing, now intertwined with an unspoken fear of the unknown. Why was Max so fixated on the coffin? Was it merely the confusion of a loyal pet mourning his owner? Or was there something deeper, something darker at play? The pastor, sensing the growing unease, stepped forward to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, let us not forget why we are here today," he began, his voice steady, but lacking the conviction needed to dispel the tension. "We are here to honor Sarah's life and to find solace in her memory. Max's behavior is perhaps his way of mourning. Let us give him grace, as he too has lost someone dear." Though the pastor's words were meant to comfort, they did little to ease the discomfort permeating the room. Max's barking continued intermittently, each sound cutting through the pastor's eulogy like a knife. The mourners could not help but glance at the coffin, their imaginations running wild with possibilities they dared not voice. The air felt thicker with every passing moment, the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down on everyone present. Max's growls grew softer but more insistent, his focus unwavering. It was as if he were trying to communicate something urgent, something that could not be ignored. And then, as if compelled by some unseen force, a man in the crowd stood. "Should we check?" he asked, his voice trembling but resolute. His question hung in the air, met with a mix of nods and nervous glances. The pastor hesitated, his gaze shifting from the mourners to the coffin and then to Max. Finally, he gave a reluctant nod. The decision was made. As the lid of the coffin was slowly lifted, the room seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on Max, whose barking stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, a moment stretched taut with anticipation. And then the lid creaked open, revealing what lay inside. What they saw would haunt them forever. Max had not always been the confident, loyal dog everyone admired. He was once just a scared, malnourished pup with little hope of survival. It was Sarah's compassion that changed everything. The first time they met was not under the most ideal circumstances. Sarah had been out for a walk one afternoon, a simple stroll through the local park, when she spotted a small, trembling dog huddled by the bushes near the edge of the path. The dog was dirty, its ribs clearly visible beneath a scruffy coat of fur. Its eyes, dull and wary, looked up at Sarah as she approached, and it made no effort to move. Sarah could tell at once that the poor animal had been abandoned. Her heart broke as she crouched down, speaking softly to the dog. "Hey there," she murmured. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The dog flinched at the sound of her voice, but did not run. In that moment, Sarah knew that this was not just a random stray. This was a soul in need of help. For a few moments, she simply sat there, talking gently, letting the dog get used to her presence. She didn't move closer, allowing the dog to feel in control of the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the dog made the first move, crawling cautiously toward her. Sarah's heart lifted as she reached out, slowly offering her hand. Max, named after the popular cartoon character Sarah adored, nuzzled it, weakly at first, but with an undeniable sense of trust. She knew right then and there that their lives would forever be intertwined. The first days at home were a blur of uncertainty and adjustment. Sarah had prepared her small apartment to welcome Max, setting up a cozy bed in the corner of the living room and filling a bowl with water. But the first night was difficult. Max didn't know how to relax. He wandered aimlessly around the apartment, his eyes filled with confusion. It took hours before he finally curled up on the rug, his tiny body still trembling as he closed his eyes, exhausted. But Sarah was patient. She stayed by his side, talking softly to him, assuring him that he was safe. In the mornings, she would wake up to find Max lying next to her, his little body pressed close to hers for warmth. He had quickly learned that Sarah was his protector, and he began to trust her more with each passing day. The initial fear in his eyes was slowly replaced with gratitude. As time went on, Sarah saw Max's true nature begin to emerge. He started to follow her everywhere. If she moved from one room to the next, Max was right behind her, his paws padding softly on the floor. If she sat on the couch to read or watch TV, Max would jump up beside her, curling up at her feet or resting his head on her lap, his gentle gaze looking up at her as if to say, "I'm here for you." Max was not just a pet, he was Sarah's constant companion. He sensed when she was sad or stressed, his usual playful energy turning into calm comfort. There were many times when Sarah would find herself crying, and Max would be there, nudging her gently with his nose or climbing onto her lap, as though offering solace. It wasn't just that he wanted to be close. He knew, instinctively, that his presence could heal her heart. He had a special way of knowing when Sarah needed him most. On the days when she came home from work feeling drained or defeated, Max would greet her at the door, tail wagging furiously, eyes bright with excitement. His enthusiasm always lifted her spirits, reminding her that there was more to life than the stresses of the day. Max was not an ordinary dog. He was a loyal guardian, always watching out for Sarah. On walks through the neighborhood, Max would stay by her side, his ears alert, eyes scanning the surroundings. If anyone walked too close, he would stiffen, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah as if to shield her from harm. His protective nature became evident on more than one occasion when a strange dog or person approached, and Max would stand between Sarah and the unknown threat, his stance firm and unyielding. But Max's loyalty went beyond his protective instincts. It was in the quiet moments, the ones that passed unnoticed, that Sarah realized just how deeply connected they had become. Max would follow her into the kitchen as she cooked, watching her movements with curiosity and a hint of amusement. When she worked at her desk, Max would lay at her feet, content to be near her, occasionally resting his head on her lap, his deep sighs the only sound in the room. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Max was never far from Sarah, whether she was running errands, sitting in the park, or even enjoying a quiet evening at home. Wherever Sarah went, Max followed, his loyalty unwavering. They had become an inseparable pair, each filling the gap in the other's life that had once been empty. But it wasn't just about companionship. Max taught Sarah lessons in patience, love, and selflessness. He had a unique way of showing her the value of unconditional love. In return, Sarah gave him the only thing she could, her heart. She took care of him, not out of obligation, but out of a deep desire to give back the love he had so freely given her. There were moments when Sarah would stop and reflect on the journey they had shared. From the day she found him abandoned in the park to the day he had become her rock, Max had been a steady source of comfort and joy. Through all the highs and lows of life, through the quiet moments and the chaotic ones, Max had remained by her side, showing her what true loyalty and love meant. And Max, in turn, had flourished under Sarah's care. His coat became shinier, his eyes brighter, and his personality more confident. No longer the frightened stray who had once cowered in fear, Max was now a strong, spirited dog, his playful bark filling the house with joy. Their connection was simple, yet profound. It wasn't in grand gestures or dramatic acts, but in the everyday moments that spoke volumes. In the way Max would curl up beside her at night, the way he would tilt his head when she called his name, the way his eyes lit up every time she walked through the door. This was love, not just a bond between a woman and her dog, but an unbreakable connection forged in the heart of loyalty, trust, and devotion. As Sarah watched Max grow and thrive, she knew one thing for certain. She had been blessed to find him, just as he had been blessed to find her. They had been given a second chance at life, together, and that was all that mattered. It was an ordinary Thursday morning when Sarah's world turned upside down. She had woken up early, just as she always did, with Max by her side, his head resting gently on the pillow next to hers. She smiled as she reached out to scratch behind his ears, his tail wagging lazily in response. Little did she know that within hours, her life would change forever. That morning, Sarah didn't show up to work. At first, her colleagues thought it was unusual, but they didn't think much of it. It wasn't like Sarah to miss a day without letting anyone know. When the day turned into evening, they started to worry. Attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, and panic began to set in. By the time the police arrived at her apartment, the door had been forced open, and the scene that awaited them was one of quiet devastation. Sarah was lying on the floor of her bedroom, her body cold and unresponsive. There were no obvious signs of injury, no indication of foul play, yet the cause of death was impossible to determine at first glance. The doctors speculated that it might have been a sudden heart attack, but no one could say for certain. The absence of any medical history that would explain such an event only deepened the mystery. For Max, the world seemed to crumble at that moment. The connection he had with Sarah ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. It was as though he knew something was wrong before the rest of the world did. His behavior changed almost overnight. The first signs of Max's distress came the night after Sarah's body was discovered. Normally a calm and affectionate dog, Max began to act strangely. He refused to eat, pacing around the apartment as if searching for something or someone. His eyes, once filled with warmth and trust, were now wide and full of confusion. He would not stop moving, wandering from room to room, sniffing at the door as though expecting Sarah to walk through it at any moment. But it was the howling that truly unsettled those around him. Late into the night, when the apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, Max's mournful cries echoed through the halls. His howls were not the playful sounds of a dog seeking attention. No, these were desperate, heart-wrenching wails, as if he could sense the void left by Sarah's absence in the most primal of ways. Neighbors began to complain, and the apartment management reached out to Sarah's family, concerned for the well-being of the dog. They found Max at the front door, scratching at the wood as though trying to escape. His paws were raw, the door marked with deep scratches. He would not leave that spot, even when his family tried to coax him away with food or toys. It was as if he had locked onto a singular thought: Sarah will come home. In the days that followed, Max's behavior grew more erratic. He started to growl at shadows, his hackles raised in warning as if someone were lurking just out of sight. His restlessness intensified. He would not sleep in his bed anymore, instead choosing to curl up by the front door, occasionally lifting his head and sniffing the air, ears perked as if expecting Sarah's familiar scent to drift in from the hallway. One evening, as Max sat by the door once more, his gaze fixed on the doorknob, a knock echoed through the apartment. Max stood, ears flat against his head, his growl low but steady. It wasn't a sound of greeting, it was a warning. No one dared to open the door immediately. When the door finally creaked open, Max rushed toward it, sniffing the air frantically. But there was no sign of Sarah, no explanation for his sudden change in behavior. The family members who had been helping with arrangements were left confused, unable to calm the dog, who was clearly on edge. It was almost as though Max was sensing something beyond their understanding. As the funeral preparations were underway, Max's distress reached a boiling point. He refused to leave the apartment, his obsession with the door growing even stronger. The family tried to coax him outside for walks, but he would resist, pulling against the leash and whining, refusing to go anywhere near the front entrance. On the morning of the funeral, Max's behavior grew even more unsettling. As the family gathered to say their final goodbyes to Sarah, Max remained in the apartment, whimpering by the door. His eyes were filled with desperation, and he began pacing in circles, his movements frantic. He had never acted like this before. The tension in the air was palpable as Max's cries grew louder and more insistent. Every time someone entered the apartment, Max would stop them, barking and scratching, as though urging them to stay with him. His instincts, which had once kept him by Sarah's side through the happiest and saddest of moments, were now on high alert. It was clear that Max was sensing something was amiss. His deep bond with Sarah, one built on trust, love, and shared memories, had been shattered. He could no longer understand why she was not there. Something inside him knew that she was not coming back, but his grief and confusion manifested in ways that no one could comprehend. The family had to make the difficult decision to leave Max behind as they drove to the funeral home. But as they prepared to leave, Max refused to let them go. He stood by the door, his paws digging into the floor as he barked, his tail stiff and his eyes wide with panic. It was a heartbreaking sight. Max, the dog who had once been so happy and carefree, now seemed lost in a sea of sorrow. Max's unsettling behavior continued throughout the funeral proceedings. Family members noticed his restlessness, his unrelenting vigilance. It was almost as if he were guarding something, waiting for someone to return. But no one could understand what he was guarding, or why. Even as the mourners gathered to honor Sarah's memory, Max's behavior lingered in the background, like a shadow no one could shake off. His howls, his pacing, and his frantic scratching at the door were a constant reminder that something far beyond human comprehension was at play. Max knew deep down that something wasn't right. He knew in his loyal heart that the love he shared with Sarah had not yet been fully understood by those around him. The funeral home was filled with soft murmurs, the hushed tones of grieving family and friends gathering to pay their respects to Sarah. The room, usually a place of comfort for those saying their final goodbyes, felt heavy with sorrow. Candles flickered in the corners, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the room, and the air was thick with the scent of flowers, the kind that whispered of endings. The relatives and friends stood around Sarah's casket, their eyes red and swollen from crying. Some wiped their faces with handkerchiefs, others simply stared at the closed coffin, trying to come to terms with the suddenness of her death. It was hard to believe that this vibrant woman, the one who had filled rooms with laughter, was now gone. Her absence seemed almost too much to bear, and the sadness hung over them like a dark cloud. In the midst of the mourners, the priest stood at the front of the room, his voice a calm contrast to the heavy atmosphere. He recited prayers, his words steady and measured as they drifted through the air. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. His voice was soothing, an anchor amidst the chaos of grief. The prayers spoke of peace and eternal rest, offering the family a sense of comfort they so desperately needed. But there was something unsettling about the stillness that followed each prayer. The mourners remained quiet, yet there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something they could not yet name. And then there was Max. Max, despite the attempts to keep him away from the ceremony, had followed them to the funeral home. His eyes were filled with an unspoken pain, his body tense, his every movement a reflection of the anguish he felt. He stood at the back of the room, his gaze locked on Sarah's casket. His once playful demeanor had vanished. Now, he seemed like a different dog entirely. Quiet, watchful, and troubled. For a while, his presence went unnoticed by the mourners as they focused on the ceremony. But then, as the priest continued with the prayers, Max's ears perked up. His body stiffened, and his eyes narrowed as he suddenly let out a loud, sharp bark. The sound echoed through the room, slicing through the silence like a knife. It was jarring, out of place in the midst of the somber ceremony. Everyone turned toward Max, startled by the interruption. The priest faltered in his recitation, his voice trailing off as the mourners glanced nervously at each other. Max barked again, louder this time, his eyes fixed intently on the coffin. There was no sign of playfulness in his voice, just pure, unrelenting distress. His tail was rigid, and his body trembled with tension. The mourners shifted uneasily in their seats, some exchanging uncomfortable glances, unsure of what to make of the dog's behavior. One of Sarah's relatives, a young woman who had been sitting closest to Max, stood up to try and calm him. "Max, come here, boy," she called, but her voice lacked the usual warmth it would have held in other circumstances. It was filled with uncertainty, as though even she felt the unease radiating from the dog. Max ignored her. His barking grew more frantic, more insistent, as though trying to warn them of something they could not see. He was fixated on the coffin, his growls deepening in volume as if sensing something unseen. The mourners' discomfort grew. Some covered their ears, others exchanged worried glances, while a few stood up, moving away from Max as if afraid of his sudden aggression. The priest's voice quivered slightly as he continued with the prayers, but it was clear that his confidence had been shaken. The atmosphere, once thick with grief, had shifted, now tainted with a sense of unease that no one could explain. The reverence of the ceremony had been disrupted by Max's strange, unpredictable behavior, and it left a lingering chill in the air. The mourners tried to ignore the disturbance, but it was impossible. Max was relentless. He barked again, this time rising up on his hind legs as if trying to reach the coffin. His eyes were wide with alarm, his body trembling with urgency. Some of the relatives were now openly staring at him, their faces etched with confusion and concern. "What's wrong with him?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the dog's barking. "Why is he acting like this?" Another relative, a man in his late 40s, stood up, visibly agitated. "Maybe we should take him outside," he suggested, but no one moved. It was as if the room had become frozen, held captive by the tension between grief and the inexplicable behavior of the dog. Max continued to growl low in his throat, his gaze fixed on Sarah's coffin, and a heavy silence settled over the room once again. It was as though he had cast a shadow over the ceremony, his actions taking on a gravity that no one could dismiss. The priest faltered again, unsure of what to do. The words of the prayers had lost their soothing quality, replaced by an eerie sense of dread that no one could explain. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Max stopped barking. He stood still, his head tilted slightly to one side, his ears perked as if listening to something the others could not hear. His body was taut, his muscles tight with anticipation. The mourners watched, their breaths held in quiet tension. Max's gaze lingered on the coffin for a moment longer, and then, with a soft whine, he lowered his head and sat down. His body seemed to deflate, as if the storm within him had passed. But the unease remained. It was as though, in that brief moment, Max had revealed something the others hadn't yet understood. His behavior was not random, nor was it without reason. There was something about Sarah's death that he had sensed. Something beyond the physical, beyond the visible. The ceremony continued, but the impact of Max's strange behavior lingered in the room. The mourners returned to their places, but the air felt thick with unspoken questions. What had Max sensed? What had he been trying to tell them? The tension of the moment hung over the proceedings, like a shadow that no one could shake. In the days that followed, the strange behavior of the dog became a point of conversation, but no one could provide an answer. They had all felt it, the oddity of the moment, the sense that something was amiss. Max had interrupted the ceremony, but in doing so, he had also opened a door to something that no one could quite explain. And for those who had witnessed it, Max's actions would forever remain a haunting memory, one that would linger long after the prayers had ended and the final goodbye had been said. The tension in the funeral home lingered, like a thick fog that refused to dissipate. The mourners, still reeling from Max's strange behavior, had returned to their grief, but an unease remained. No one could shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Max had sensed something they could not. His odd behavior, so out of place during a time meant for mourning, had left them with more questions than answers. It was Sarah's older brother, Richard, who finally broke the silence. He had been quiet throughout the ceremony, his eyes red-rimmed with grief, his mind clouded with confusion. But Max's unsettling actions had disturbed him deeply. He had known the dog well, and he could sense the loyalty in Max's every gesture, even in his frantic barking. Something about the way Max had reacted to Sarah's casket seemed too profound to ignore. Richard had heard whispers among the relatives, murmurs of unease and discomfort. Some had suggested that perhaps the dog was just reacting to the chaos of the moment. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Max was trying to tell them something, something they had all missed. As the last of the mourners filed out of the room, Richard stayed behind, his gaze fixed on the coffin. The priest, who had been offering the final prayers, nodded to him, and the room fell into silence. Richard turned to the medical examiner, a stern woman named Dr. Evelyn Harris, who had been present throughout the process, overseeing the preparations for Sarah's burial. "Dr. Harris," Richard said quietly, his voice tinged with both sorrow and urgency. "I need to know if there's more to this. Something about Max's behavior doesn't sit right with me. He's been acting like Sarah is still here, like something's wrong." The medical examiner, a woman known for her calm demeanor, raised an eyebrow. She had been the one to confirm Sarah's death, and everything about the case had seemed clear-cut. There were no visible signs of foul play, and the cause of death, at least on the surface, had been attributed to natural causes, possibly a heart attack or an aneurysm. Yet she couldn't entirely dismiss the nagging doubt that had been growing in her mind. She had seen cases before where things weren't always as they seemed. "Richard," Dr. Harris said, her tone steady but thoughtful, "we've already performed a thorough examination. There's nothing to suggest foul play. Sometimes grief makes us see things that aren't there." But Richard wasn't convinced. He felt a sense of duty to Sarah to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or unsettling it might be. "What if something was missed?" Richard insisted. "What if there's a reason Max is acting the way he is? What if Sarah isn't at peace, and we're missing something? I can't let this go." Dr. Harris hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. There were protocols, there were procedures to follow, but something in Richard's voice, a mixture of desperation and love, spoke to her. She nodded slowly. "All right, we'll open the coffin. But I need you to be prepared for the possibility that we may not find anything unusual." The room fell into a heavy silence as Richard and Dr. Harris walked toward the casket. The mourners who had remained behind looked on, their faces a mixture of curiosity, concern, and disbelief. Max, still sitting by the door, watched them intently. His eyes, though filled with the same sorrow as before, seemed to hold a knowing, a certainty that the others could not understand. With trembling hands, Dr. Harris took hold of the latch on the coffin. The sound of the latch opening echoed through the room, the noise sharp and jarring. Slowly, the lid of the coffin was raised, revealing the still, lifeless body of Sarah. Her face was peaceful, but there was something unnatural about the stillness. It was almost too serene, too perfect. As the lid opened further, Dr. Harris leaned in to examine Sarah's body more closely. And then, something caught her eye. It was the faintest movement, so subtle that it could have been missed by anyone not paying close attention. A slight twitch in Sarah's hand. The room fell into stunned silence. Richard stepped forward, his heart racing in his chest. What was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky with disbelief. Dr. Harris knelt beside the coffin, her eyes scanning Sarah's body with intense focus. Her fingers gently pressed against Sarah's wrist, searching for a pulse. For a moment, there was nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath. And then it came, slow and faint. But there, a pulse. The gasps that followed were deafening. Is she alive?" Richard's voice cracked as he looked from Dr. Harris to Sarah's still form. The medical examiner's face turned pale. She had never encountered anything like this in all her years of practice. She quickly checked Sarah's chest for signs of breath, but there was none. The faint pulse was all they could feel, a sign of life that seemed to defy all logic. Suddenly, Max let out a low, guttural growl from the corner of the room. His body was rigid, his eyes locked on Sarah as though he knew, in some inexplicable way, what they had just uncovered. Dr. Harris called for help, her voice frantic now. As they carefully examined Sarah's body, it became clear that this was no ordinary case. The faint pulse was accompanied by disturbing signs of a struggle: bruises on her arms, scratches on her neck, and marks on her hands that suggested she had tried to break free from something, or someone. The room was thrown into chaos as the realization set in. Sarah had been buried alive. The signs of life, the pulse, the struggle, it all pointed to a terrifying conclusion. She had been trapped in the coffin, unable to escape. Her death had been far from peaceful. Max's barking grew more frantic, as if he were reacting to the horror that had just been uncovered. His instincts had been right all along. The loyalty that had driven him to bark and howl in distress, to warn them of something they couldn't see, had saved them from the unthinkable truth. The mourners, now visibly shaken, struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The funeral they had come to expect had turned into a nightmare, and as the reality of Sarah's fate began to settle in, the once quiet room was filled with the sounds of shock, disbelief, and horror. Max's growls finally softened, his eyes never leaving Sarah's body. It was as if he understood that, though the truth had come too late, the story was finally being told. He had saved her, even in death. The revelation hit like a tidal wave, and the funeral home, once filled with sorrow, was now consumed by horror. Sarah had been buried alive, a fate no one could have imagined, yet Max had known. He had sensed the faintest breath, the smallest movement, something no human eye could detect. His relentless barking and unusual behavior had been his way of signaling to the world that something was terribly wrong, and it was only now, in the face of undeniable proof, that everyone understood. But how had Max known? How had he been so certain when no one else had noticed anything amiss? The answer lay in the bond he shared with Sarah, a connection so deep, so intuitive, that it transcended the limits of ordinary understanding. As the mourners gathered around the coffin, still reeling from the shocking discovery, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the relationship between his sister and Max. He had always known that Sarah and the dog had shared something special, but it wasn't until now that he understood the extent of their bond. Max's loyalty had been unwavering throughout Sarah's life, and in the end, it had been that very loyalty that had saved her. Max had been with Sarah from the very beginning, long before Richard could have ever imagined this dreadful turn of events. Flashback to a crisp autumn morning several years earlier when Sarah first found Max. She had been walking home from work, exhausted after a long day. As she passed an alleyway, a small, trembling figure caught her attention. It was Max, then a scruffy, malnourished stray dog, huddled against a pile of discarded boxes. His ribs showed beneath his matted fur, and his eyes were wide with fear. Sarah, never one to ignore the suffering of an animal, had knelt down to offer him a scrap of food, but Max had been too terrified to approach. "I'm not going to hurt you," she had whispered, reaching out gently. Slowly, he had crept forward, his instinct telling him she was someone who could be trusted. That day, Sarah took Max home, nursing him back to health with all the tenderness and love she had to offer. And from that moment, Max had become her constant companion, never straying far from her side. Flash forward to moments of their life together, small, intimate moments that hinted at the deep bond they shared. Max had always been there, through every high and every low. There had been the time when Sarah had fallen ill with the flu, and Max had refused to leave her side, lying next to her on the couch, his head resting gently on her lap. He had looked up at her with those intelligent, soulful eyes, as if to reassure her that everything would be okay. And when she had gone through a difficult breakup, Max had followed her from room to room, his presence a comfort, his quiet gaze a reminder that she was never alone. Max had even understood the simple routines of Sarah's life, knowing when it was time for her morning coffee or when it was time for their walks. He had learned the rhythm of her life, the subtleties of her moods, and had always adapted to her needs, providing comfort in the most unspoken of ways. But perhaps The most telling moment of all had come just a few days before Sarah's tragic death. Max had become agitated, restless in a way that Sarah had never seen before. She had noticed him pacing around the house, scratching at the door, his ears perked in a way that made her uneasy. "Max, what is it, boy?" she had asked, though she had received no answer. He had merely continued his pacing, stopping only to whine softly at her, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't understand. At the time, Sarah had chalked it up to the stress of her busy life. But now, looking back, Richard realized that Max had sensed something was wrong long before Sarah's passing. He had known that something was amiss, even before it had been visible to anyone else. Richard's thoughts were interrupted as he looked down at Max, who now stood quietly by Sarah's side, his gaze still fixed on her. It was as though he was waiting for her to wake up, to rise from the death he had always known to be a lie. Max's instincts had led him to the truth, no matter how much they had tried to ignore it. His behavior, though erratic and disturbing to everyone else, had always been an expression of love and loyalty, a dog's way of trying to protect the one he loved, even from beyond the grave. Flashback to a quieter moment in their home, when Max had first shown signs of his exceptional intelligence. Sarah had been sitting at the kitchen table, her mind racing with the responsibilities of her job. Max, who had been lying on his bed, suddenly stood up and trotted to the door, his eyes wide and his posture tense. Sarah had looked up, puzzled, but Max had not barked or made any sound. He had simply stared at her with a knowing look, as if urging her to follow. "You want to go for a walk?" Sarah had asked with a smile, though she thought it was odd that Max would insist on a walk at this hour. But Max's behavior was persistent. He didn't move, didn't sit back down, just continued to stand there. It wasn't until she had opened the door that Sarah had realized what Max was trying to warn her about. A faint smell of gas had wafted into the room, something she would have never noticed had Max not led her to the door. She had immediately turned off the stove and opened the windows, narrowly avoiding what could have been a tragic accident. It was in that moment that Sarah understood just how deeply Max was in tune with her, how his instincts were sharper than she had ever given him credit for. He had saved her life that day, just as he had saved her now. And now, in this moment of horror and revelation, Max had done it again. His loyalty and intelligence had led them to the truth, to the discovery that no one else had been able to see. He had been the one to expose the truth, to prove that Sarah had not died peacefully, that she had been taken from them too soon, her life cut short by forces none of them had understood. As the mourners stood in stunned silence, Richard could not help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Max had been the one to uncover the truth, to honor his beloved owner's memory in the only way he knew how, through his unwavering loyalty, his boundless love, and his extraordinary instincts. The truth was clear now, and though it came too late, it was undeniable. Max had saved Sarah, even in death. He had uncovered the darkness that had been hidden away, and in doing so, had brought justice to a story that was still unfolding. Max's intelligence and loyalty, once thought of as ordinary traits, had now been proven to be extraordinary, and in the end, it was that very bond between dog and owner that had revealed the truth no one else could see. The room was still in chaos, and the events of the last few moments seemed almost too surreal to process. The mourners, now in disbelief and shock, stood scattered around the coffin, their gazes shifting between Sarah's body and the hero who had brought them to the truth, Max. The dog, once merely a loyal companion, now stood as a symbol of unwavering devotion, his loyalty saving his beloved owner from a fate no one could have imagined. But while the mourners struggled to grasp the depth of the tragedy, the consequences of Sarah's untimely death, now confirmed as a result of being buried alive, were only beginning to unfold. The local authorities had arrived shortly after Dr. Harris's discovery, their initial skepticism quickly turning to grave concern as they processed the scene. The police began to question whether Sarah's death had been a result of foul play. The bruises on her arms and the marks around her neck suggested something far more sinister than a natural death? Had someone harmed her before burying her alive? Or was this the result of some tragic, yet unintentional error? The investigators worked quickly, their focus shifting between the coffin, the scene of the burial, and the shocking discovery that Max had somehow sensed the truth before anyone else. They had heard stories of dogs alerting their owners to danger, but nothing had prepared them for this. How had Max known? How had he been able to detect the faintest signs of life when no one else had seen them? Richard, still reeling from the discovery, stood with the police, trying to make sense of it all. His mind raced with questions. Could Sarah have been harmed by someone she knew? Could there have been foul play involved? Max, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, looking down at the dog. He knew. He saved her, even after she was gone. The officer, who had been observing Max closely, nodded slowly. Dogs are known to have an extraordinary sense of smell and intuition, but this is something else. He must have sensed her pulse, something that we couldn't. His behavior, it wasn't just grief. He was trying to tell us something all along. Max, who had been lying quietly by Sarah's side since the coffin had been opened, lifted his head and gazed at the officers with steady, knowing eyes. He had done his part. He had alerted them to the truth. Now, it was up to the authorities to uncover the full story. As the investigation unfolded, the emotional consequences of Sarah's death were felt not only by her family, but by everyone who had known her. The shock of the burial alive was a trauma that no one could easily shake. There was a sense of helplessness in the air, as friends and family members grappled with the realization that Sarah had been denied a peaceful rest. But it wasn't just the emotional toll that weighed heavily on the family. It was the uncertainty of what had truly happened. Had someone tried to harm Sarah? Was she the victim of a tragic accident? Or was there something darker at play? For weeks, the investigation dragged on. The police interviewed friends, family, and colleagues. They examined the evidence, hoping to piece together the puzzle of Sarah's last days. Max's behavior, once seen as mere instinct, was now central to the investigation. His heroism had led them to uncover the truth, but would it be enough to unravel the mystery of her death? As the legal process moved forward, one thing became clear. Max's actions would not be forgotten. The dog had not only saved Sarah's life from an untimely grave, but he had also spared her family from the agonizing unknown. His loyalty and intelligence were now seen as a remarkable, heroic act that had changed the course of the investigation. The community began to recognize Max for his role. A local newspaper ran a story about the heroic dog who had saved his owner from a horrific fate. The headline read, "Max, the Hero Dog. How one loyal companion saved a life, even after death." The article detailed the remarkable bond between Max and Sarah, highlighting how the dog's instincts had led to the discovery that no one else had been able to uncover. It was a story that resonated with readers, one that touched their hearts and reminded them of the power of love and loyalty. Max was even honored at a local ceremony, where he was presented with a medal for his bravery. The recognition was a bittersweet moment for Richard and the family, as they knew that no amount of praise could bring Sarah back, but it was a small comfort to see Max finally receive the credit he deserved. The emotional toll on the family was profound. Richard and Sarah's parents, devastated by the loss, struggled to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded. They had buried their daughter, only to have the truth emerge in such a traumatic way. But through their grief, they couldn't help but be thankful for Max, who had brought them closer to the truth. His unwavering loyalty had given them something they would have never thought possible: a sense of justice and the knowledge that Sarah had not been abandoned in her final moments. Max's behavior, once seen as strange and disturbing, was now revered as a testament to his love for Sarah. He had saved her, not just from death, but from the injustice of being forgotten. His instincts had uncovered the truth, and his heroic actions had led to a conclusion that no one else could have reached. For Richard, the pain of losing his sister was still raw, but there was a small flicker of peace in knowing that Sarah had not died alone, and that her loyal dog had done everything he could to protect her, even in death. As time passed, the investigation slowly revealed that Sarah's death had been a tragic accident. A medical issue, perhaps a heart attack or stroke, had caused her to lose consciousness, and in her state, she had been mistakenly buried before anyone realized she was still alive. There was no foul play involved, but the emotional impact of the discovery was undeniable. In the end, justice was served in a way no one had anticipated. Sarah's family had answers, and they could begin to heal. Max, the dog who had once been a simple companion, was now forever remembered as a hero, a loyal friend who had never given up, even when everyone else had. Max's legacy would live on, a shining example of loyalty, intelligence, and love. And though Sarah was gone, she would never be forgotten, thanks to the dog who had saved her from a fate no one could have imagined. As the days passed and the investigation came to a close, the heavy weight of grief remained in the air. But something else lingered too, a sense of admiration, awe, and profound appreciation for Max, the dog who had never once left his owner's side, even in death. In the quiet moments that followed the funeral and the revelation of Sarah's tragic death, the family found themselves reflecting on what Max had done. His instincts, his loyalty, and his unbreakable bond with Sarah had not only saved her from a terrible fate, but had also brought the family together in ways they hadn't expected. The dog, once seen as merely a pet, was now viewed as a true hero, someone who had done everything in his power to protect his beloved owner, even after her passing. One evening, Richard sat alone on the porch of his childhood home, watching Max as he lay on the grass, gazing up at the stars. Max had always been a quiet, gentle presence, but now, in the aftermath of it all, his silence spoke volumes. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to settle on Richard's heart, and he found himself staring at the dog, lost in thought. How had Max known? Richard couldn't help but wonder. How had the dog been able to sense the faintest signs of life when no one else could? It was as if Max had known that his owner was still there, still fighting to hold on to the life that had been so abruptly taken from her. Richard reached down and patted Max's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur beneath his hand. Max's eyes met his, and there was an almost knowing look in them, a quiet understanding, as if he was aware of the depth of the bond between them. "You saved her, buddy," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." As he spoke, a single tear slipped down his cheek. It was a tear of sorrow for his sister, yes, but it was also a tear of gratitude for Max. The dog had done what no one else could have done. He had shown them what true loyalty meant. In a world where connections could be fleeting, where people could be lost and forgotten, Max's devotion to Sarah had been constant, unwavering, and pure. Later that day, Richard's mother, who had been quiet throughout the aftermath, found herself standing in the living room, looking down at the framed photograph of Sarah with Max at her side. The photo had been taken years ago, on a sunny afternoon during one of their walks. Sarah's smile was wide and carefree. Max's ears flopped playfully as he trotted beside her, his tail wagging with joy. It was a snapshot of a simpler time, a time when everything had seemed so certain, so secure. As she stared at the photo, her chest tightened with the weight of the loss. Tears welled in her eyes, and she placed a trembling hand on the photograph. She could almost hear Sarah's laughter in the background, feel the warmth of the memories that had been forged in those quiet moments. But what struck her the most was the way Max had been there for Sarah, not just as a pet, but as a true companion, a protector in every sense of the word. "My sweet girl," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "And you, Max, you saved her, didn't you?" Max, who had been quietly resting on the rug nearby, lifted his head at the sound of her voice. His eyes met hers, and it was as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. He patted over to her and nudged her hand gently, as if offering comfort, as if reminding her that he too was grieving the loss of his owner. A sob escaped her throat as she knelt down to hug Max. She held him tightly, burying her face in his fur, letting the tears fall freely. She could feel his warmth, his heartbeat, and in that moment, it was as though Sarah had never truly left them. Max had been the bridge, the lifeline that kept them connected to the love they had lost. "You were her everything," she whispered into Max's fur. "You were everything to her. I just wish I had known." Max let out a soft whine and pressed his head against her chest, as though offering the only comfort he knew how. And for a long while, they sat there together, the world outside falling away as the bond between dog and owner, between Max and Sarah, lived on in the hearts of those who had been touched by their love. The story of Max's unwavering loyalty was shared in hushed tones by the family, whispered among friends and loved ones who had witnessed the incredible bond between the dog and his owner. His actions had shown them all the power of love and loyalty, of the kind of bond that transcends time and death itself. Though Sarah was gone, Max's devotion had ensured that she would never be forgotten. His loyalty had become a lesson, a reminder that love, in its purest form, knows no boundaries. And while the world had lost Sarah, they had gained something extraordinary, an understanding of the depth of the connection between humans and animals. Max had proved, without a doubt, that the love of a dog is as powerful as any love in the world. And so, Max became a symbol of that enduring love, a hero not only in his actions, but in his very nature. His legacy would live on in the hearts of those who had known him and Sarah, a lasting reminder that the greatest acts of loyalty are often the quietest, the ones that go unnoticed until they reveal their full truth. In the end, Max's story was not just about a dog who saved his owner. It was about the profound impact of loyalty and love, the kind that never fades, even after death. As the months passed, the memory of Sarah remained vivid, etched into the hearts of those who had known her. But through it all, one thing stood firm: Max's legacy. The dog who had once been seen as just a loyal companion had become something much greater. He was a symbol of unconditional love, protection, and devotion. His actions had saved lives and uncovered truths that no one else could have imagined. In doing so, he had changed the lives of everyone around him. Max's story became more than just a tale of tragedy and heroism. It became a reminder of the powerful bond between humans and animals. People from all over the town came to honor him, offering their appreciation and admiration for the dog who had acted out of pure instinct and loyalty. He was no longer just Sarah's dog, he was a symbol of something far greater. He was a hero, a protector, a faithful friend who had never once faltered in his commitment to his owner, even in the face of death. Richard, who had grown so close to Max through the ordeal, couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had witnessed firsthand the unwavering loyalty that Max had shown, not just in the days following Sarah's death, but throughout his life. And while it was impossible to fill the void left by Sarah's passing, Richard found solace in the fact that Max's love would never fade. "Max," Richard said softly one evening, as the dog sat beside him, looking up with those knowing eyes. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay. You've given us something we never even knew we needed." But as much as Max had given to Richard and the family, there was one final gift that was yet to be offered: a chance for the dog to find peace. The journey that had begun with his devotion to Sarah had come full circle, and it was now time for Max to be allowed to heal, to live in a place where he could finally rest, where he would be loved as deeply as he had loved. One crisp autumn morning, Richard made a decision. He took Max to a nearby family who had long been looking for a companion, a home where Max would be cherished and cared for, a place where he would never again know the pain of loss. The family, warm and welcoming, had heard of Max's story, and they knew that this was the dog they wanted to adopt. As Max stepped into his new home, there was a sense of peace that filled the air. The family greeted him with open arms, and Max, though cautious at first, quickly recognized that he was being welcomed into a space of love. The children, eager to make him feel at home, played with him in the yard, and the parents showered him with affection, offering him the same kind of comfort he had once given Sarah. Max lay down on his new bed that evening, the soft blanket around him providing a sense of security. He let out a deep sigh, his eyes closing as he drifted into a peaceful sleep. For the first time in a long while, Max felt at peace. The burdens of the past, the loss of his owner, the uncertainty, the pain, had finally lifted, and he could now rest in the knowledge that he was loved, cherished, and cared for. His journey had come to an end, and it was a journey that had left an indelible mark on all those who had been touched by his devotion. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Max's new family grew closer to him, and they came to understand the depth of the love that had shaped this dog's life. They knew that Max was special, not just because of his actions, but because of the way he loved, the way he protected, and the way he gave his heart without reservation. And in the quiet moments, when Max would lie on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, there was a sense of contentment in the air. His days of sorrow and loss were behind him, and his new family would carry on his legacy. They would remember the heroic dog who had once saved his owner and brought justice to a family. But they would also remember the dog who had loved with all his heart, who had given everything for those he cared about. Max's legacy, forever intertwined with the memory of Sarah, would live on as a testament to the enduring power of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bond between a dog and his owner. And though his story had been one of heartache and tragedy, it was also a story of hope, of redemption, and of the love that transcends time and space. In the end, Max had found peace. Peace in the love of a new family. Peace in knowing that his devotion had made a difference. And peace in the knowledge that he would always be remembered.